think of rape culture as the collection of ways in which sexual violence is normalized for perpetrators while its victims are blamed and shamed. The term rape culture can seem shocking and plausibly was meant to be so by the people who coined it because it links the starkest label for sexualized violence to the everyday, mundane factors that normalize it. This, I think, goes back to comments that my colleague, Professor Atchison, used to open today's ceremony, talking about just the banality and common character of rape culture. The label invites us to recognize how seemingly minor conventions or presumptively non-violent aggressions function both to excuse and to perpetuate sexual violence of many kinds. Demanding that someone else smile or wear prettier clothes. Conversation that inappropriately sexualizes others, for instance, co-workers in a professional context. Complaining about being friend-zoned. Telling jokes that depict sexual violence as amusing. Catcalling. Seeing someone else's inebriation, emotional distress, or other signs of reduced capacity as sexual opportunity. There are many common cultural expressions of typically male entitlement to dictate the appearance and conduct and demand sexual access to, especially but not exclusively, women's bodies, or bodies represented as female. Now, the tolerance and defense of those common expressions, including those that are not on the face of things violent, this consolidates and deepens the underlying attitudes that manifest in acts like pressuring for sex or refusing to accept a refusal of sex. How does this turn to the topic of ignorance? I'm speaking here as somebody who, well, I keep denying that I'm an epistemologist, but I'm told that the more I publish on epistemology, the least plausible that is. It bears on it in the following way. I think this will sound familiar to you. In my experience, people who defend the less overtly violent manifestations of rape culture attitudes, saying things like, boys will be boys, or sticks and stones, but words, why take offense? Or, oh, people are just stupid sometimes. Don't overreact. Just let it roll off you. Those people are very surprised and offended at the idea that they're producing rape apologetics. When I see news stories or social media discussions of rape cases that are so serious that even the media judge them worth reporting on, I inevitably see commentary, I expect you do too, typically from men to the effect that rapists deserve the death penalty, right? That there's nothing too bad for a real racist. A lot of times this is framed in terms of speaking as the father of a daughter. I can tell you that if anybody ever, why, there'd be the holy cow, there'd be pieces of that person, right? No. How could someone so implacable in their attitudes towards rapists be engaging in rape apologetics? Well, this extreme attitude is premised on the idea that rape is a crime so far beyond the pale, so inconsistent with common mores, that practically no punishment for it is severe enough. And that principle cuts both ways. Because behavior that turns out to be frequently within the pale, behavior that is perfectly consistent with at least many common mores, must, by that principle, not be rape. And thus it is that the impetus to see one as morally opposed to rape, conjoined with the conviction that one's culture or society isn't fundamentally broken with respect to sexual violence depends crucially on not coming to know or recognize the connections between common expressions of rape culture and the continuum of cases of sexual violence. So consider a recent case, from last week at Western in London. This is a case where students living in, off-campus university housing had written on their window in soap or chalk or something a chant that had some years earlier, achieved ignominy in the Canadian educational context as being a chant that another university's students had used during Frosh Week orientation. And the slogan was, "No means yes, yes means anal." Naturally, this provoked some pushback. When the story was reported in the London Free Press, the university's housing mediator was quoted as saying, "I get it, the message is really bad, but students do dumb things." So again, sort of taking this expression of rape culture, but lumping it under the heading of students just being unwise, right? Doing something foolish. And it's true, students frequently are profoundly unwise, often as bad or almost as bad as non-students. The question is, how does one remain ignorant of the connections between expressions of rape culture like that and sexual violence in a form that is unmistakable to anyone? This is where the epistemology comes in. Now, philosophers, for a long time, have been concerned about epistemology, that is, the study of knowledge, what constitutes knowledge, what it is that justifies beliefs, how we get it, and what it's good for. And that makes perfect sense. Epistemology has almost universally focused on the conditions for the possession of knowledge, for the possession of justified belief, because it's typically been animated by an interest in the value of knowledge and justification. What can you do with true or reliable beliefs that you can't do without them? Well, the answer is you can do a lot of really important things. You can cure diseases, you can predict the weather, you can cook the same meal on different days. You can form other true beliefs that follow from the true beliefs you've laid your hands on. But look, accurate beliefs don't just enable actions, and they don't just enable the formation of other beliefs. They also rationally constrain actions, and they rationally constrain other beliefs that you can hold. That's not to say they universally constrain them. I say they rationally constrain them. It means in as much as you're thinking clearly and attending to those beliefs and holding them in front of you and trying to be epistemically responsible. They constrain as much as they enable. And because of this, epistemologists have started to pay attention to a different way of thinking about knowledge, and that is to think not just about the value of having it, but to think also about the value that people seem to find and that systems seem to find in not having it. It's natural to think of ignorance as an unhappy state, right? Something that is maybe we're stuck with because none of us is infinitely educated, but any time you learn more, you're empowered by knowledge. This is a perspective, sometimes described as agnotology, or the study of ignorance, that encourages us to think seriously about aspects of our own lives or aspects of our culture or society that are facilitated by ignorance. Now, we all have ways of life and forms of life that contribute to our ignorance. An example that the philosopher at the University of Victoria, logician Audrey Yap, recently used in a talk that I was at. I really like it. She says, I ride my bike everywhere, and this appeals to me because I don't ride my bike everywhere, but I ride it a lot. And she said, you know, one of the things that is most at the heart of the lived experience of people who drive everywhere is the price of gas. People who drive all the time are exquisitely sensitive to the price of gas, and drivers will meet up, and they talk about the weather, but they also talk about where they saw gas cheaper. And it goes down by 1/10 of a cent, and people notice that. She said, I couldn't tell you the price of gas. I couldn't get within 10 cents of telling you the price of gas. And I'm pretty bad that way too. I don't know the price of gas. Why not? Because I don't drive that much. I ride my bike. I have a way of life that epistemically closes off certain facts about the world that are really important to other people. And that is just fine, right? When it comes to the price of gas, right? That's inevitable. Sometimes the arrow of explanation flows the other direction, though. Sometimes it's not that I just have a way of life that means I'm ignorant about things. Sometimes I'm ignorant about things in order for me to continue having the way of life that I've gotten used to and value. There's a kind of social or practical or pragmatic value to my continuing to be ignorant. This is the heart of the study of agnotology. That is, thinking about load-bearing ignorance. Ignorance that is constructed, right? Maybe not deliberately by any one person, right? This is where we have to think about different kinds of explanations for how we have and how we lack knowledge, right? It's easy in the case of knowledge to think that if I have it, it's because I've sought it out, or if I have it, it's because it's impressed itself upon me in some way. With ignorance, sometimes people are ignorant because either their own decisions have explicitly been constructed to make them ignorant, or because somebody else's decisions have been explicitly made in order to keep them ignorant. Sometimes, though, all we get by the way of an explanation is something like this. If this ignorance didn't shore up this kind of socially important phenomenon, it wouldn't exist. Right? So all you get is this kind of counterfactual dependence. Doesn't have to be any one person or even any group of people who determined that we should all be ignorant. What you get is a system of ignorance that arises as a kind of aggregate effect of very small decisions that people make to not take seriously the fact, as I put it earlier, that they live in a culture that is fundamentally broken with respect to sexual violence, because taking that seriously would require all sorts of really hard decisions. It would require all sorts of social awkwardness. Taking that seriously would require that when you're a guy like me and you're hanging around with a bunch of guys like me and somebody makes a joke, right, about rape or about violence towards women, you have to intervene. You can't be silent. Oh, geez, that's kind of awkward. I'm not sure I want to. Yeah, really? Yeah, you have to. If you think it's connected in the way that I sketched earlier. If you can remain ignorant of those connections, though, well, you're absolved of that obligation. In a short presentation like this, I don't want to even attempt to get into the mechanisms by which ignorance can shore up rape culture. But what I do want, and what I'd be satisfied with, is if you feel like you're equipped when you encounter manifestations of rape culture to see it through that lens and to think, what is it about what I'm seeing here that is both facilitated by and in its own way contributes to the practice of keeping quiet and keeping ignorant? The less we know, the less we're impelled to act. The less we know, the less we're rationally obliged to intervene. If we think of it in these terms, hush you. If we think of it in these terms, we can see very clearly the pressure that incentivizes, let's say, systemic ignorance about rape culture. And by keeping an eye out for it, we recognize it, and that in turn empowers us to act. Thanks very much.